Last time, those of you who were in the audience will remember, I set out a project. The project was to try and conceive political philosophy, what I called the political perspective, and in particular liberalism as a conception of politics, as continuous with ethics, rather than, as in the social contract tradition, as discontinuous with it. And in the course of the argument, I stressed a distinction between what I called volitional well-being and critical well-being, that difference roughly coming to the difference between what I want my life to have and what I should want my life to have. Just at the end, and I'm afraid at quite a clip, I considered two issues having to do with the content of critical well-being. That idea I called mysterious, and I'm sure my discussion of it bore out, at least, that in my hands it was a rather mysterious idea. The two issues I meant to raise just at the end were these. The first is an issue about the source or character of critical well-being. Is this idea of critical well-being the product of living or the performance of living? We can look at a life in two ways. We can look at it as a collection of events, experiences, of impact, of achievements, and we can ask whether these were the events, experiences, and achievements that a life ought to have. Whether, looking at them, surveying them, we can say, yes, a life made up of those is a good life to have led, something in which an agent can take pride. The second way we can look at a life is different. We look at it through the person whose life it is, and we ask, did that person select this life? Did that person set out to do this? Did that person value these experiences? I suggested that we might call this string of ideas the question of endorsement, to sum up those last series of questions in the idea, did the agent endorse the value of the life? Now, I should have made clear that it's, of course, not in question that an agent can make his life good just by thinking it is. The center, the nerve of the idea of critical well-being is that a judgment about that is a judgment and might go wrong. So there's a certain asymmetry to this question. I want to raise, in effect, the question, can a life go well though the agent doesn't endorse the respect in which the life is going well? And I suggested that there were two views one could take on this matter. I called the first the additive view. It says, the events that make up a good life, the components of a good life just on their own, contribute value. Of course, if it's also the case that the agent recognizes their value, that's good too, frosting on the cake. The second view I called constitutive, and that argues, on the contrary, that the agent's perceptions and endorsement are screens or filter through which our judgments of value must pass, so that no life goes well in virtue of something that is in no way endorsed by the agent, even though it's also true that had the agent endorsed it, then that would have contributed much value to life. Imagine the case of the befriended misanthrope, the person whose idea of a good life stresses independence and who disdains the affection, friendship of others, but who happens, in spite of all he can do, to be lovable. And on his deathbed, he's surrounded by these much-hated friends. And his last strangulated cry dies on his lips as he says, "You're ruining my death as you ruined my life. Get out of here." And then he dies. And we imagine some friend of his saying, "Sad life that, didn't come to much. At least we can say this for him, he had a lot of friends." Well, that would be, you see, that would be to take what I'm calling the additive view of the matter. And I won't repeat the arguments which I may or may not have made last time. It's, to my mind, an extremely implausible view. It makes no sense, to my mind, this additive view, makes no sense of two things. It doesn't make any sense of the distinctive character that the value of a life has for the very person whose life it is. Don't think the additive view makes sense of that, nor can it make sense of something I think at the center of this whole idea that our life can go well. I'll touch on this later, but it's the idea that the kind of value a life can have has to do with its being something created. It's a kind of work of art. And if that's right, then the additive view must yield to what I call the constitutive view, the view that requires us to screen judgments through the agent's own perceptions. The second question I took up involved not so much the source, but the structure of critical value, one's critical interests. I compared two views, one that says that a good life, the character of a good life, is in the following sense timeless, transcendent. The life that's the best life to lead is the same in all places and circumstances. The description of the best life makes no reference to circumstance, though, of course, you can't do as good a job, say, at advancing Christianity, if that's what the great life consists in. You can't do as good a job before Christ as you could after it. Compared to the view that says, no, a good life is itself context sensitive, it's indexed. You can't tell whether someone's had a good life without knowing something about the circumstances in which that life was lived. You see, as I stressed last time, the contrast here is between the view that says what is a great life is given transcendently. The circumstances in which we live, the sad fact that we don't live for very long, the sad fact that we're limited in our resources, the fact that our culture is very different from what it might be. All these work simply as limitations on how far we can advance towards the good life, and that's to be compared to the view which is associated with the indexed picture, which says some of our circumstances are not limits, but parameters of value. They're things we actually have to take into account in describing what a good life would be. Once again, I'm going not so much to argue for a particular view as simply to take sides. I favor, and I rather believe most of you would agree with me, the indexed view. I labor the point not so much because I want to assure you that the transcendent view is implausible. It is implausible. It's implausible for several reasons, one of which is that we could make sense of it only if we could make sense of the idea of a perfect life with no limitations. The life that would be a perfect life for creatures with facilities superior to ours, say, who lived longer than we do. And first, we can't begin to imagine what that kind of perfect life would be fit for them. And also, it's implausible to the point of foolishness, isn't it, to think that our lives can be at best only a tiny fraction as good as the perfect life would be. That seems to me to distort the role that this idea has in our lives. But I stress this point, not so much to persuade you of one view or the other, and as I said, I think most of you will already be persuaded to the view I favor, as to indicate, remind you that the view I and perhaps you favor, the indexed view, carries with it a certain intellectual responsibility. Because now when we think about the good life, when we think, as I argued we do from time to time, about what kinds of lives are appropriate, then we have to describe the question that we're putting to ourselves in something of the following way. We have to say, not what is the good life, but what is the good life for people? And then we have to finish the proposition. And the great question, the question that becomes inescapable once you take this view on the philosophical issue I raised, is how do you complete that proposition? How do we say what is the reference class that we must take into view? There are two obvious errors, poles of error, and we must avoid them both. On the one hand, if thinking about this we say, well, we're not going to accept many of our circumstances as parameters. We're going to treat most of them as limits. We're going to say something like, we finish the proposition in the following way: what is the appropriate life for a human being? Then it seems to me that we're close to tumbling back into the transcendent view, which I rejected. But if, on the other hand, we make the opposite mistake, and we say, for example, what is the appropriate life for someone situated as I am, say, with wanting the things I want, in the culture that I inhabit, if we pack everything in, then we've destroyed the distinction between volitional and critical well-being, because we've left nothing to be questioned, nothing to be called into question. The answer, what is the best life, if we describe it so thickly as all that, becomes, well, just the life that you're living. So we must avoid both of these, and I want to illustrate the problem, because it's of special importance to us in considering political philosophy. I want to raise one particular question about this distinction between circumstances as limits and circumstances as parameters. One question about how we complete the proposition. What shall we do about resources? Those things that we need, money, food, shelter, opportunity, space under the law, and so forth. How shall we treat the resources available to us as parameters? Again, there are two areas we'd have to avoid. Again, polar errors. I mean, suppose we said we should be leading the life appropriate to people with all the resources there are. So we treat the actual resources we have as by way of limits on how good a life we can lead. Then we have to be able to imagine something I believe to be unimaginable, which is the perfect life with infinite resources. But if, on the other hand, we fall into the opposite error, and we say, lead the life appropriate. Here is the assignment, as it were. Lead the life appropriate to somebody who has the resources that you happen to have, or are likely to have, or something like that. Then we've fallen into the opposite error. We look at the starving untouchable, and we're forced to say, what a good life that person is leading. That person is leading exactly the life appropriate to the resources of a starving untouchable. And that seems wrong, doesn't it? I have a suggestion. I'm sure some of you will have seen it coming. The way we must finish that proposition, or in any event, the way we should, the way we introduce resources as parameters, is through the vehicle of a theory of justice. We must say, the assignment that we have is the assignment to lead a life appropriate for the resources, or with the resources, that we are entitled to have, with the resources that it's appropriate for us to have. Now, meaning by appropriate, appropriate in a community where resources are scarce and others have demands. You will see that in this suggestion, I'm taking up a position in an ancient philosophical squabble about the place of justice in ethics. You remember last time I distinguished first-person ethics, or well-being, which we've mainly been talking about, from third-person ethics, morality, which we mainly haven't been talking about. And one strong philosophical tradition, I dare say the dominant one, argues that justice belongs in third-person morality. Justice is among the constraints which a decent moral person will accept, limiting how good a life he can lead out of deference to the claims and demands of others. Plato took the opposite view, famously. Plato said that justice figures in first-person ethics and not third-person ethics alone, so that the person who acted unjustly injured himself, herself. The view I'm taking up supports Plato's view up to a point. I say up to a point because I want to emphasize that this, some of you may think rather Pollyanna-ish view, is meant to apply only to critical well-being. It would be absurd to suppose that my volitional well-being is somehow connected to my theory of justice. It makes perfect sense for me to say what I want, and want very much, is what I know I wouldn't be allowed to have under a just regime. That makes perfect sense. What I'm calling into question is whether it makes sense for me to say my life would be a more distinguished life in the critical sense if led on the basis of resources beyond those that I'm entitled to have. See, I think that this suggestion that I've made explains one strong intuition quite well. It explains why we distinguish between the starving untouchable who says my life is awful because, in the critical way, because I've had to live it in a state of near starvation with no resources to do anything beyond survive, if that. We distinguish between that person and the connoisseur who says my life is miserable because I haven't been able to collect more than 7 or 8 post-impressionist pictures, and I desperately want to. We distinguish between those two and say, now again, nothing moral about this, just about their judgments about how well their own life is going, and we have no sympathy for the connoisseur making the complaint, but every sympathy with the person at the bottom, and that is because we are relying upon, we're feeding into these judgments, assessing their claims with a theory of justice built in. The claim will strike some of you, I'm sure, as less plausible when it goes to the top. That is, when a person says, my life goes worse, and this of course reminds one of Plato, my life goes worse if I use more than the resources that are appropriate to me. And I hope that in the seminar we can discuss this problem, as my own view is something like this. Though justice enters into our idea of what a good life is, it's only one component, and it can get trumped. But still, the force of saying that it's a parameter is that when we judge a life, we still must ask, is this a good life responding to the assignment, live a life with resources or appropriate to having resources that you're entitled to have. And it may be that somebody, I mean, this is what I presently think, somebody who takes more resources may achieve great success as a result of their injustice, but still the life as a whole has to be judged under the description of that assignment, and it must count heavily against it, at least, that it's invaded resources it had no business occupying. Very well. That's what I wanted to say about the philosophical questions, the questions of abstract ethics. I told you I was turning my back on politics to consider them, and now I want to turn back to politics again. Bearing in mind the 3 ideas that I've stressed, First, the distinction between volitional and critical well-being, and the special importance that some of us, some of the time, attach to the latter. Secondly, the fact that critical well-being has as its source or character the constitutive perception of the agent. And third, that critical well-being must be sensitive to some features of our environment, our circumstances, by way of parameter, that resources are among these, and in my submission, that justice presents itself as the right parameter to scale resources. Those are the three claims I wish you to bear in mind as I turn back now to politics. And I turn back to the conception of liberalism that I deployed last week. You remember I called it liberal equality. And I described its features. Some of you will remember the auction as giving us the sense of an equal division of resources. Remember the fact that compensation had to be paid because of the difficulty of capturing through the auction device differences in talents and other handicaps. And you will also remember, though I'll say more about this in a few minutes, you will also remember the place of liberty in the general scheme of equality of resources. I said last time that there were four leading ideas that I think of as structurally important ideas in this conception of liberalism. And each of these attracts an obvious objection. And I now want, one by one, to consider these four leading ideas and try and assess the objections against the background that we've now constructed. First objection was this: liberal equality draws an important, indeed sovereign distinction between personality and circumstances. It aims to make resources equal, not welfare. And that means that though I am allowed to present to the community my various handicaps, or under some circumstances, my bad luck, as counting, as entitling me to some compensation, as counting in the distribution, the calculation of equality, I am not entitled to present to the community in that way the fact that I have expensive tastes or ambition, the fact that I yearn for a career that will take, say in politics, that will take a fortune under present arrangements to supply, or that I yearn for a collection of art that I can't possibly have were I not a billionaire. Now, what justifies this crucial distinction? The critics will say, I am no more responsible for my expensive ambitions or tastes than I am for my mental ability, physical health, bad luck. Why should a scheme which calls itself a scheme of justice draw this untenable distinction, which treats part of what I'm not responsible for differently, much differently from the rest? I accept, stress this, I certainly accept the premise behind this objection. That is, I'm not about to tell you that I'm causally responsible, that I pick and choose amongst my convictions the way I do amongst my neckties. It may be true that, having read The New Yorker all my life, I conceive a desire to be the kind of person who would drink those extremely repellent drinks advertised in Baccarat crystal glasses. I could say, I've got to become the kind of person who actually wants to live that kind of life. But if I do that, I think that's much overrated, by the way, I mean the degree to which we can and do that, but still, if I do that, it's in response to a conviction, a deeper one or higher one, depending on your geographical metaphor, which I haven't myself chosen, namely the desire to be the kind of person who, and so forth. Now, I don't challenge that, nor do I challenge its pertinence in some kinds of political philosophy. In particular, I don't doubt the pertinence of that point, namely that I didn't choose my convictions any more than I choose my handicaps. I don't doubt the pertinence of that point in discontinuity theory. As Rawls emphasizes, for example, the theory of the self that he wants to build into his political philosophy is what he calls a political conception of the self. It's not drawn from any comprehensive piece of ethics. It's not drawn from any attempt to capture what we really are as people. It's a political construct, and as such, there is no reason why it shouldn't have to respond to the objection, why construct something which will work to the disadvantage of people with expensive taste, but not to the disadvantage of people with handicaps. But that's not where we are, because we're attempting to construct a political philosophy continuous with our ethics, and that means that we need a representation of ourselves to ourselves, which can do duty for both ethics and political philosophy. Indeed, we want the political philosophy simply to be the development or the application of our ways of thinking about our own life in the political occasion. And we can't think in our own life of our ambitions, those things we recognize under the heading of judgments we make about our critical interests, the judgment we make when we say, I must be a politician. We can't think of those as limitations on our capacity to achieve the good life, because they define for us the good life. We might, if we thought our convictions were false, then there'd be limitations, but then they wouldn't be our convictions. Now, of course, it is true that people labor under obsessions and other features of personality which they regard from the inside in a wholly different way, not as something entering into their account of what their critical well-being would be, but directly as limitations. So I'm not speaking about those. I'm speaking about those ambitions we recognize and endorse, and I'm saying we can't treat those as limitations. If we want a continuous ethics, we have a continuous political philosophy, we have no choice but to draw the fundamental, crucial distinction that we must draw in ethics between the account we give to ourselves of what a good life would be and the circumstances in which we must live this. We couldn't give that distinction up and still have anything recognizable as an ethical life, or indeed as leading a life in the way we now do at all. The second challenge to liberalism, in the conception I was constructing liberal equality, the second challenge had to do with the choice to define, to take as the metric of justice resources rather than welfare. Once again, the argument, I reminded you of the way it's been put recently by Amartya Sen. People want resources only as means to their well-being. Only a fetishist would think that resources, food, shelter, opportunities, medium-sized dry goods, paintings to hang on the wall, only a fetishist would think that these had value in themselves. And if that's right, isn't it perverse to try and make people equal in their resources, which the auction and the envy test aim to do? Why not try to make them equal in their welfare instead? Well, let's consider, as I think you'll see the answer, why not, if we begin by considering how a political theory has to be structured if it is going to take welfare as the metric of justice. And this applies as much to utilitarianism as to equality of welfare. It applies to any theory that takes, without regard to the function of welfare, that takes welfare as the appropriate, or well-being, as we're saying, as the appropriate metric. It has to work in two stages. That is, we, the population, have got to one by one, or after discussion, form views about where our own well-being would lie. We have to say what we want. What would make our lives go better? We have to report that to the central bureaucrats with all the computers, who then set about, through a process of investigation and construction, set about that, and here the function does become important, so that the degree to which, say, each of us has what he or she wants is maximized on average, or is made equal, or something else. Now, you see what a problem that enterprise is, that two-level enterprise is, for a theory of justice that emphasizes, that takes welfare to be critical well-being. You see the problem if you adopt, of course, I should say, if it's volitional well-being that's in question, there isn't the problem I'm about to describe. But if critical well-being is in question, then there is the following apparently very serious problem. I said earlier, when discussing the parameters of a good life, that justice must figure among them. And if that's so, then I need at least a rough sense. Precision is not part of the story, of course, but I need a rough sense of what justice entitles me to have in order to decide where my critical what sort of life it is appropriate, what I should count as a good life to lead. And if that's right, then there's an evident problem on the horizon, namely, if I need a theory of justice internal, in the spirit of Plato, to my sense of where my well-being lies, then that can't be the same theory of justice that's used later to decide how much of our good lives we should be allowed in the name of justice to achieve. It can't be the same theory, because there would be a kind of circle. I wouldn't know until I knew what justice allowed, where my well-being and other people's well-beings lay. And I wouldn't know that until I knew what justice required, and therefore I couldn't get to the second stage at which justice is supposed to come in without having already anticipated that stage. Now, once again, that problem, even if I'm right that it's a serious conceptual problem, is no problem for the discontinuity approach. It's no problem for a theory like Rawls's. I should add, Rawls doesn't, of course, use a welfarist metric. He uses a resource metric. But a discontinuity theory can use a welfare metric free from this puzzle that I'm describing to you, because once again, as Rawls emphasizes, the theory of justice that we use in politics is discontinuous. It's something we construct in the contractarian spirit. And it makes perfect sense to say to the public, each of you use your own theory of justice, deciding what your well-being where your well-being lies, and then, when that information is furnished, we will apply the rather special notion of well-being that we use, which is, say, utilitarianism or equality of welfare. And since this is discontinuity, there's no problem. But for us, again, for continuity, for people who think that the theory of justice that we use publicly and collectively must be available to us as individuals too, because politics should be seen as part of our overall moral experience and continuous with it, that is not available. And if what I've said so far is right, that is, if and to the degree to which justice figures within first-person ethics, then for first-person ethics, justice cannot presuppose well-being. It enters into well-being, and justice must be on some other space, and I think the available alternative is the space of resources. That, in any event, is my argument, and if it's right, it allows us to make this reply to the critics who say liberalism on this resourcist reading doesn't take welfare seriously. The reply is, oh, but it does. It takes welfare very seriously indeed, because it stresses that the well-being that we should really be concerned with is critical well-being understood in such a way that justice is already in the first person part of the story. The third of the challenges to liberalism that I named last week and promised to look at this week brings us more directly back to the contrast, the apparent incompatibility between the two perspectives that I began by describing, the personal and the political. Because it reminds us that in the personal perspective, we are partial. We do not show in our decisions equal concern for all, and yet liberalism is, as I've described it, not only insists that the metric of justice should be resource, it insists that the function of justice should be an egalitarian function, in particular equality judged by opportunity cost. Now, suggestion is what we're meant to think, indeed what I tried to lead you to think last week, is that there's a problem here, at least on the surface, because from our political lives, from our personal points of view, we don't show equal concern for all, and yet liberalism insists that when we decide things collectively, each of us, voting, lobbying, and so forth, should be guided by the strongest possible principle that we must show equal concern for all. You see, I don't think that there is a conflict. There better not be, because those two propositions, from the personal standpoint, we must have attachments, we must be connected, and that from the political standpoint, we must not, we must be impartial, are among the strongest things we feel, I believe. Both of them. There better not be a conflict, and I don't think there is. Indeed, I think there's not so much a conflict, but a symbiosis between these, at least understood as ideals. That is, the claim that I'm now making is, as ideals, there is no problem about joining these two, provided that they are fused together in a single, overall, comprehensive position. No problem, because if equality of resources were in fact achieved, then, using a phrase I used in answer to a question last time, the goods that each of us would receive would be morally ours. Think back to the auction, that funny, interminable auction, the auction of everything there is. I said that when it was finished, if it ever did finish, the envy test would be satisfied among us. Each of us have, prescinding now from problems about differences in talents that we have to take care of in some other way, prescinding from those problems, each of us has, in the spirit of equality I was holding out, an equal share of resources. But that kind of equality is in no way damaged when I use my own resources, they are mine, really mine, to do with as I want, and the equality is not prejudiced or compromised once it's been realized in the right way by my decision to spend treasure, time, and concern on some people, though not others. That isn't true in general of welfarist theories of justice, because welfare arrangements are too unstable. Nothing is morally mine, because welfare patterns keep changing. And apart from the convenient hocus pocus of two-level arguments, the utilitarian must never rest. But justice, once achieved, genuine equality of resources is not disrupted by partiality using only the treasure allocated to each of us by a genuinely equal distribution of resources. So we might say these two go together. Once we see politics as the extension of our ethical life, we can say it's somehow misleading just to say we're partial in our personal lives, because we earn that partiality by being egalitarian in our political life. That is the avenue through which we reconcile. And I think there are actually technical reasons why equality can be achieved. If by equality you mean equality of resources, only through politics. It can't be done by individual effort to treat all others with equal concern. Now, again, I certainly don't mean to suggest that through this kind of argument we are morally, as it were, off the hook. I mean, resources are not equally distributed among us. I merely mean to suggest that as ideals, these two ideals, the ethical ideal of attachment and the political ideal of equality of concern, are not enemies, but allies. They go together, each in a way parasitic on the other. What lessons might we draw? I think there are lessons of two kinds to draw from this. The first, I think, is this. If I'm right in this argument, then considering this contrast adds to the foundational case for liberalism, at least for liberalism conceived in the way I'm calling liberal equality. It adds to the foundational case because it says to us, since you prize, and you do, and you are right to prize, the sense of personal commitment and attachment, all the more reason why you are responsible for creating a just political system in the liberal mode. You have taken, as it were, that on already. Don't blame liberalism for the apparent conflict. Blame our failure properly, even decently, to attempt to execute it. The second lesson, I think, is rather different. I haven't said a word up to now about what you might call the substantive side of critical well-being. I mean, what kinds of lives we actually ought to lead, situated as we all are now. I think there is in the story I've just told a suggestion, at least, about that. The suggestion will have an Aristotelian ring, namely, politics must be part, for any of us, for those of us who live with resources we have no claim to own. Politics, the struggle, and of course, if I'm right, in the liberal interest, must be part of the good life. And that introduces the fourth, that consideration. That is my suggestion that we actually do have an argument here that one kind of life is necessary in interests of integrity. We do have a bridge, it seems to me, to the fourth and final question. The fourth and final challenge about liberalism that I promised to consider, and in many ways the most difficult and complex of all. The deepest kind of conflict between the two perspectives, the kind that does excite and make us nervous, the kind that appears not amenable to the resolution by symbiosis that I just offered when I was talking about equality, is raised by the problem of liberalism's neutrality. Thinks some forms of life are desirable and other forms of life are degrading and contemptible. We differ about that. Some of us think the life of the homosexual is degrading. Others think, I wince as I say this, others think that the life of the consumerist who must have the latest gadget, electronics subspecies, is contemptible. We believe these things with great force. They guide us. We can't call them into question. They're things that they belong to a set of ideas such that if everyone called everything we thought about in that way into question, we again couldn't go on with ethics, with living as we know it. And yet liberalism asks us to check all that at the polling station door, to forget these commitments in politics. And that is the final challenge. Is this defensible? For people who know with a degree of commitment and conviction that distances their commitment to liberal politics or to any other politics, people who know things about the good life, which they are asked to forget at the political moment. How can we explain that? I begin with an observation. In the philosophy texts, the opinion thrives that the argument in and around this neighborhood about the state's duty to enforce morality, that argument is about paternalism, a form of paternalism sometimes called moral paternalism. We might actually call it critical paternalism, because we have that distinction, and that's a useful way to use it. In the real world, particularly in America, and I think this is now true widely in the world, the argument isn't about that at all. In the main, I have spent a good deal of time, well, I brag, some time, in the company of representatives, delegates from the moral majority. And you can take it from me, they are not exercised by concern for my immortal soul. That is not what they are moved by. They just want me to get my sin the hell out of the country that they think belongs to them. And that's different. It's different because their claim is based, and I really can't emphasize this too strong, their claim is based on canons of distributive justice, not paternalism. That is, they think that, for example, as the majority of opinion, they are entitled to a moral environment, to moral space in which they can raise their children in convictions about the good life that they favor, in which they can journey free from reminders of what they contemn. It has to do, though you'll think this is a funny way to describe it, it has to do with property rights over the moral space. That's where I believe the battle is, and about that, liberalism has something to say, and I've already told you what it is. Because liberalism rejects the notion of distributive justice latent in that usually inarticulate complaint, we are the majority, this is our country, we can have the kind of moral space we want. To which liberalism replies, you have hold of the wrong theory of distributive justice. Let me tell you about the auction. Because, of course, the auction is strikingly different from the spirit of this rather totalitarian claim the country is ours. The auction is not a winner-take-all. In the auction, people who have different tastes and ambitions, who want to do different things with their lives, who have, let's say, a demand on the physical and moral space in which to do it, take their chances. They will gain or lose. They will rise or fall in their success, depending on a variety of things, including how numerous they are, how much space they need, and a host of other considerations, all of which work in the rather proportional representation way of the auction to come out with some judgment about what they are entitled to have by way of their fair share. And just as the connoisseur who whines before the auction begins, realizing that he will not be able to buy a roomful of Gauguins with the pitiful 1,000 clamshells that he's been offered. He knows he can't do that, and he says, I would like there to be some ground rule of this auction which says in advance that I win. To which the reply is, there are no such ground rules. The only ground rule that we can accept as a ground rule that has any prayer of revealing accurate opportunity cost is one of liberty. And we say the same thing to the person who says, I don't want my moral space cluttered up with those homosexuals or those consumer gadgeteers who offend, who are noxious stenches in the sight of good people. We say to them, you are not allowed all the space. A fair share of the space is yours. And how that works out, what zoning requirements we will have to deploy in order to arrive at a fair space for you, we know in advance it's not going to be all the space there is, and therefore we are not going to give it all to you in advance without costing you a single clamshell by setting up the criminal law as the way you want as the baseline for the auction. Now that, it seems to me, is, roughly speaking, the heart of the matter on these debates as they emerge in politics. And I think that's important because I want now to claim the affirmative message of liberalism on this kind of question, on, let's say, the neutrality question. The affirmative message of liberalism doesn't reside in the general neighborhood of autonomy or respect for eccentricity. The affirmative claim, the center of the claim, that which is doing most of the work, is liberalism's normal, egalitarian view of distributive justice. But though that's an important part of the story and in the literature neglected, it isn't the whole story, because now there does come, back to our two perspectives, now there does come a complaint. And the complaint now takes the following form, assuming the argument's been accepted that I've just made. Complaint now takes the following form: but have you no heart? Justice is not everything. Look at those people. They are leading these horrible lives. Surely don't stand on justice, but go to their aid. And how shall I go to their aid? With the steel of the criminal law. I should come to their aid by imprisoning them, or in some perhaps milder way. That's the argument. And here we have the genuine intersection of the two issues. This is where paternalism does enter the story. It's there, though it comes in later than it normally is thought to do. But we have something to say about that issue, don't we? We have to say, and this will be the main point I want to make about this, that the paternalist argument used about critical well-being in the way it is has made the mistake of believing that the good life is additive rather than constitutive. That is, I refer you back to our discussion about the agent's endorsement as a screen, as necessary, as that which gives critical value, the value of living, its creative structure. And this argument entirely leaves it out, as if somebody could be, his life could be transformed, neglecting the endorsement side simply by beefing up the components judged independently. And that, if you accept what I argued before, can't work. And so, once again, we repair to our ethics and say, if you accept that, then we have diffused the paternalist argument. That, however, is only the beginning, and I think it's the least interesting part of the story. Because anyone who's seriously attracted, thoughtfully I should say, attracted to the paternalist argument, forget the distributive justice point just now, must be looking beyond the life of the person who will be coerced, and must be looking to the lives of others. And I want to consider a development of the paternalist argument, making it more powerful than the one I just rather easily, I think, refuted by appealing to our earlier judgments about the source of critical value. I want to consider two arguments, the first of which appeals to the possibility that through coercion, or perhaps simply inducements, bribes, arranging the tax code so as to discourage the practices we think are wrong, that in these ways people will actually be led to change their minds so that they will albeit retrospectively, endorse the opinion that we think they ought to have had in the first place. That's the first of the two views, and the second is more interesting still because it says we despair of many conversions of that kind amongst people now living. But what we hope, and our hope is for future generations, that by eliminating the conduct, though not the desire, we will reach a point of conceptual contraction where the lives we think debased will no longer be part of the cultural vocabulary, where it won't even be on the menu, where we won't have to worry about coercing obsessive renegade collectors of new computers, because it will never occur to anyone that value could lie in that direction. These are two, let's say, interesting forms of paternalism, and liberalism must have something to say to them. It says to the first, that which hopes for critical conversion, it says, the endorsement constraint that is built in to the constitutive view of critical well-being is not a mechanical constraint. I mean, imagine our misanthrope on his deathbed. He's about to expire with a strangulated cry, and someone comes in with a hypodermic needle full of the love chemical and mainlines it into him, so that in the 10 seconds before his actual death, he says, I was wrong. I love you all. Goodbye. We haven't done any, this is called brainwash. We haven't done anything in that way to restore the value of his life. And we take from that crude case, it seems to me, the following instruction, at least. We need a theory of endorsement which filters out genuine endorsements from those we can't count for this purpose at all. The way we form that theory, the way we draw the line, is going to be of marvelous consequence because, of course, built into anything I now say, I mean, if I were to go on and actually talk about how you would draw the line between endorsement that's mechanical and that that's genuine, how you would draw the line between persuasion and brainwashing, I would have given you a theory of liberal education, because that's part of what this is about. But I'll say, you'll be happy to hear only this, that theory, it seems to me, has got to include following device. If the person who is induced or coerced long enough so that he or she comes to accept the view that we're pushing, that can count, that conversion can count as a genuine endorsement only if we have left that person free, according to our normal standards of situations of good judgment, free actually to evaluate the issue on the merits of how good a life it is. And I just put it to you that somebody whose opinion is changed in that way is not, almost by hypothesis, left free to consider the matter on the merits in the way, for example, in which we would hope any decent system of education, even one that involved, as it all must, some compulsory aspects would do. About cultural contraction, I have less to say. I do think it's important to bear in mind when we say we're going to reform things so that for another generation these unattractive lives won't even be on the menu. We must bear in mind the caution that critical well-being is not transcendent, but it's indexed. That is, we are in no position to say what will and will not count as a good life at another time and in another generation, or so I think. We're certainly not in a good enough position, and remember the state of play of the argument, we're certainly not in a good enough position to say we must be unjust now for the sake of ensuring that people's lives later are better. Behind that lies a question that I'm not, in fact, going to touch, a serious, deep question, and maybe we can talk about it in the seminar tomorrow. And I'll just put the question. Given our reflections, I mean, even at this superficial level that we've been able to enter in these two lectures, given our reflections about critical well-being, Do we really think it can ever be in someone's critical well-being to narrow that person's imagination? It seems to me a way implausible, but it's a complicated issue, and I won't pursue it now. Instead, I think we've earned a kind of backward look, a retrospective. What shall we say in general? Well, I want to make, by way of this abbreviated summary, I want to make only 2 points, I think. First is once again about neutrality. Just at the beginning, or near enough the beginning, I said that my division between a political interpretation, the horizontal work for political philosophy, and the foundational questions, the vertical, the finding of politics embedded in other parts of what we think, that this, of course, this analytic distinction had to recognize reciprocity. And at the end of our philosophical investigations, we would return with a different view of politics. I suggested to you that one illustration of that process would be what I think it's fair to say, certainly in my own intellectual autobiography it's true, a kind of transformation of the idea of liberal neutrality or liberal tolerance. And one of the 2 points I want to make in summary is just to have a look quickly at that again. You remember I said that discontinuity treats liberal neutrality about conceptions of the good, to use Rawls's vocabulary, treats that as a methodological axiom. That's why we construct a special artificial political perspective. But that continuity had to treat neutrality not as an axiom, but as a theorem, as something we came upon at a certain stage in the argument. We have now, at least so I think, done that, and it's time to see where we stand. We stand here, I believe. Liberalism is not neutral philosophically, in the way, for example, in which Rawls holds out that it should be. I have taken positions, I've recommended positions on matters of great controversy about the character, indeed the existence, and then the character of critical well-being. So it's certainly not philosophically neutral. Is it substantively neutral about conceptions of the good, about what I've been calling well-being? Is it substantively neutral about critical well-being? Not in the third person. That is, the argument that I have made is directly addressed to questions about when we improve another person's well-being. And I've reached conclusions, and claim them to be liberal conclusions, that are quite controversial. But liberalism, constructed in the way I recommend, is, I think, neutral in the first person. It's neutral about, at least so far as I've developed it, the argument is meant to be neutral about the kinds of things I can think of as satisfactory answers to the satisfactory ways of completing the proposition I should live the life appropriate to. Why? Because any view that I can hold transcendentally, it's true that I said we must reject the transcendental view, but any view I can hold transcendentally, I can also hold as indexed. And of course, though I've endorsed the screening view, the constitutive view, and rejected the additive view of critical well-being, that in no way constricts first-person views. I can't hold the view that something can be in my well-being that I don't think is. Because if I think it's in my well-being at all, then I've satisfied the requirements of the constitutive view. So I would make the claim that liberalism understood in this way is neutral, but only up to a point and in a certain way. Finally, what have we said that we might stand back and say characterizes liberalism, or at least this conception I've been calling liberal equality? What can we say about it in general? I've been stressing something, and I want to end by stressing it once more, which is the intimate connection between liberalism on this story and the whole idea of critical well-being. The whole idea that politics must respect the distinction between volitional and critical interests and must address itself to this massive question, elusive question, how do we live well? It addresses itself, however, to that question on an understanding about critical well-being, the understanding I've been trying to develop in these lectures, which I think it now fair to call humanist. And that is the idea formed of two units. First, that critical well-being is crucial, that it exists, that it's genuine and crucial. And secondly, that though of course our species and our culture, the ways in which others live with us and we with them, of course, in countless ways, all of these restrict our imagination and push answers upon us. Nevertheless, there is a residual and not eliminable responsibility that each of us has. Each of us has, one by one, humanist view, to identify and create a life valuable, so seen by us, a responsibility which we cannot eliminate, which we must acquit, which goes with living, which is what leading a life is. Now, all of that does seem to me properly formulated, better, more complexly structured than I've been able to do. All of that, nevertheless, seems to me to suggest the nerve of great visionary power for liberalism. It does have appeal. It has appeal for people like that. It's a political philosophy, finally, fit for people who accept these canons, these challenges, this awful responsibility of the humanist tradition. I'm not flattering myself that I will have convinced many of you to share this rather romantic picture that I have of the liberal tradition. I'll try again, but don't worry, not tonight. Thank you very much.
This is just a brief cadence in the evening's program, and Professor Dworkin will now be happy to answer questions or take comments.
Yes.
This may be a bit off to the side of your interest, but it is well, on the issue of how much space, moral space, say the moral majority could really buy if they were offered.
Yes.
What would you give them? A town, a school? What public space at all could they include, say, homosexuals or other people they found repugnant from? And if your answer is that they could have no public space, aren't you really saying that they can't buy any moral space in the auction?
No, you see, why can't they? There are two ways in which I should say that under the compression of trying to develop a rather lengthy argument which some of you will find of interest at greater length in the present number of the Iowa Law Journal, under the pressure of trying to compress it, I left out an awful lot that should have been there. And it is important that there are many ways in which an auction would be developed in the real world. It would have a market side, but it would also have a political side. Now, one way in which people can buy moral space is just by making that private space. That is, excluding people they don't like from their homes, up to a point from joint enterprises of a social sort. I say up to a point because clubs, particularly those with business interests, would be very different. What about the public space? I mentioned a sort of code word, zoning. And to my mind, zoning is an example of something discussed at rather length in the Iowa piece, namely anticipating what a well-structured market would do in the face of market imperfections through devices of regulation, some through the criminal law and some through zoning regulations. But we can replicate through zoning a fair division. I mean, of course, this trammels up an awful lot of argument, but if we can imagine a fair division representing the course of what I want to do to your desires, and reciprocally the course of what you want to my desires, if we can arrive at a judgment about what's a fair decision, there's no reason why we couldn't take care of part of the problem, for example, the exhibition of pornography, through zoning regulations. Beyond that, we might have to take care of the problem with more sophisticated, I keep calling these market-sensitive mechanisms, but the kind of market I now have in mind is very far from the usual one. But we can become more ingenious still and try and draw lines between behavior which is perfectly repulsive on standard grounds to many, many people, and say to the group favoring a way of life that calls for this, that they in turn, instead of it being the case that those who want to exclude them must do so in private, that they in turn must arrange private space for those sorts of activities, and so forth. None of this is easy. I'm merely trying to suggest that if we think about these as problems of justice, of a fair allocation of the space available, that we'll think in a different way from the way we think if we start talking about autonomy and paternalism. Yes?
You've spoken this evening as if your account of distributive justice were provided by the envy test and the auction entirely, and I think there must be something else. The reason I think that is, and I apologize for having asked you one version of this question
Yes.
at an earlier point, but your use of the example of the starving untouchable and the contrast between the starving untouchable and the collector of post-impressionist paintings.
Yes.
As you say, we are more sympathetic to the starving untouchable, and you say that we are because he has not gotten his due according to your account of distributive justice. But if your account of distributive justice were provided entirely by the envy test and the auction, that might not be the case, because we might well imagine a starving untouchable who says, I would not envy or prefer to trade my meager bundle for any other bundle because I think it morally inappropriate that I have anything more than this meager amount.
We did discuss this at the seminar, and yes.
You promised in some ways that I would get an answer this evening, but I'm puzzled still. So I feel it only fair game to ask you now.
Yes. And I confess to having made a mistake. I shouldn't have said, and for purposes of the present argument, if I remembered that conversation, I wouldn't. For purposes of the present argument, the fact that I chose an untouchable adds nothing to the point. So let us make it a starving member of an inner city ghetto who certainly thinks that his share is an unjustly small share. Now, and that's the point that I wished to make tonight, namely, that unless we can parameterize resources in the right way, we can't explain the discrimination we draw. Now, I just invited a lot more trouble by using the example of the untouchable, because, as you say, the untouchable might be someone who says, it's appropriate that I have this. I don't know how that person would behave in the auction, probably give all his clamshells away or something. And as I said at the seminar, and I really can do more than repeat now, for that and many other reasons, the background to the auction has to be filled in rather carefully. The auction is a necessary but not a sufficient condition of distributive equality. That's only one of many problems. If there were for example, in the background, a law saying homosexuality shall be outlawed, then the auction would still deliver a result but the result would no more be egalitarian.
I was hoping or wondering whether there was some connection between your account of, you alluded to constraint under paternalism.
Yes.
And there's some account of the conditions of liberty which would apply to the formation of the preference that people would bring to the auction.
That's right.
I think that there's some connection there, but...
Well, I'll tell you what the connection is. Last week, I said there were three rough, unrefined attitudes or dispositions that characterize liberals. Well, I talked about two of them in the lectures. I talked about the first and the third. The first was egalitarianism, and the third was a kind of neutrality or tolerance. The second, you remember, was a list of certain specific rights, which we familiarly call the liberal rights. And that's where the connection is. That is, the background to the auction, when we fall back on that story as a way of illustrating the structure of the idea, falling back on that story, the background of the auction has got to have in it provisions that, in the word I use in the Iowa piece to describe this, provide authenticity for the preferences that people bring to the auction. And that, I think, though there are many other reasons why liberals want freedom of speech and discussion, that's certainly one of them. Now, I would, as I said in the seminar, I would have to think very differently about somebody who had the view that you ascribe to the untouchables, namely the ascetic who says, I don't want very much, I don't deserve very much, and so forth. I would think very differently about that person's position if those views were formed in an atmosphere which I thought was congenial to reflection, where superstition, ignorance had been removed, opposing views invited, and discussion held place. That is the normal liberal stuff. If that view survived that kind of an atmosphere, I would not reject it. That is, I don't want to screen it out. I simply want to be sure that it's a reflective view, held not on the basis of false information, so far as we can help, and after due opportunity for reflection and argument. So the suggestion about the untouchable is that the poor untouchable is the victim, not just of poverty, but the victim of a kind of ideology which wouldn't stand the light of day. Well, let's see if it doesn't stand the light of day, if it can't survive for him in circumstances of fair investigation and discussion, then it will be eliminated in the auction.
That's very helpful and plausible, but there's one implication, which is that if the untouchable or the ascetic's preferences survive as authentic on your interpretation, then you would be committed to the view that those preferences, if they operated in the auction as I described, would provide an account of equality of resources.
Yes.
So the untouchable would be saying that this little share that I have is perfectly compatible with equality of resources.
Yes.
Okay, fine.
He would, and what's the difference between that person who I'm imagining gives away his clamshells to those he thinks ought to have them? What's the difference between that person and the person who participates with full-blooded vigor in the auction and then gives the stuff away afterwards?
That's fine. It just sounds odd as an interpretation of equality.
Well, it sounds odd because by bringing in the untouchable, you bring in the suspicion.
Kind of justice.
Bernard, yes.
Could I ask you just to expand on a point you made in passing, which I didn't follow, which was about, I think it was in a part of your remarks where you were, as it were, reconciling liberal equality of resources with a personal sphere, where expressed personal protection.
Yes.
And you made a remark that under your view, things could be morally mine after the auction.
Yes.
Which presumably meant, or it seemed to follow the argument, that meant that I could actually definitively do things with them, as opposed to views of equality of welfare, where I'd always have to be particularly consistent.
Something like that, yes.
Which reminded one, obviously, I don't know whether you had in mind, of Nozick's celebrated objection about the constant tinkering
Yes.
with any egalitarian system.
Exactly.
Now, but what I would be grateful if you'd say a bit more about is what your practical consequences are from that position. Because it seems to sound as if it may, that since these resources are morally mine, it's presumably in my power to alienate them. But if I alienate them, particularly across generations, then presumably I then am precisely confronted with the nosing problem, that is, that I have an additional legitimate transaction, each of which is expressive of the alienation of what is morally mine to somebody else. And the action is done with what anybody would regard as an inequality, not just of welfare, but resource. So it looks as if the problem which nosing fingered in all egalitarian systems
Right.
would prima facie apply much to this one.
Well, it's a different, but it applies, if at all, in a different way. And I think it is important to see that Nozick's argument, though perfectly fair, addressed to many theories of justice, was quite off the target addressed to the particular theory to which he addressed it, namely Rawls's, which was a resourcist argument, theory. That is not calling for constant tinkering. Now, because having some worry about intergenerational transfers is not constant tinkering. You needn't fiddling all the time. You can pick a particular point or two and only intervene there. But what that does bring out is that something of more general importance, and I should have made this plain, even under the unreformed personal perspective, there is a limit to how much concern we can show towards those to whom we are specially attached. I was taking on the view that, I was merely noticing that we think ourselves entitled, and in my view rightly think so, to show some special regard. But of course it doesn't follow that we must show, even from that perspective, no regard for anyone but those that we feel special connections with. Now, I think that point can be generalized into a point that gives us guidance about intergenerational transfers, about wealth accumulations. Indeed, in an extremely rough way, and getting to be a less plausible way all the time under this administration, the estate tax, you might see, as something modeled in that general way on the idea, yes, you are entitled to have some special concern, but not exclusive concern. I don't, if I had described the personal perspective more accurately, I would have put that qualification in. And with that qualification in, I don't think Nozick's point is a threat.
Well, sorry, I don't want to go on.
Yes.
Can I just say one further thing, which is that I absolutely agree with you about that. Of course, I agree that Nozick's argument is absurd in the sense that simply no argument dealing against occasional relations.
Yes.
I quite agree. But what I'm still not quite clear about is why you think there's such a dramatic difference in the answer to be given to this problem under the resource metric rather than under the welfarist metric. But it seems to be somebody who believed in equality of welfare could make exactly the same. That's the point.
Yes, I see. Well, the inequality that comes, let's take a rather simple model. I am prosperous. The resources are divided up, and you, for your own best reasons, wish to become a philosophy professor, and I wish to become a Wall Street lawyer. Though each could have done the other. Well, not as well, but still. So, off we go on our careers, and I, as we used to say in my trade, make a pile. You don't, sad. And I then give it, part of this pile, to my son. Now, you don't have any less, let's say, depends how you describe this, but you have an equal share of the resources. It is no longer true, something has happened, it is no longer true that the opportunity cost of everybody's bundle is the same. But it is true, and this is important, that your share has not been invaded by this transaction. You have no less than if I had consumed it all myself. Now, I think the asymmetry with welfarist notions, and I must be careful not to exaggerate it, that's right, But I think the asymmetry comes in here, that with the passage of not much time, a distribution that maximizes utility, say, ceases to be a distribution that maximizes utility. So that it's no longer true. If a new distribution on utilitarian lines would give me more, it's no longer true even that I have no less than I was entitled to have under the welfare side. That's what I meant by a kind of instability that doesn't take place on the resource side. Yes, Professor Arrow.
This idea of what we call distributive justice with regard to morality.
Yes.
It's a very intriguing concept, and you do suggest this idea of some kind of voluntary segregation. But if you go through this auction procedure, one of the problems is the goods are being distributed of externalities.
Yes.
And you're meeting that problem by segregation.
Right.
By having segregated, which we call zoning.
Yes.
Laws. Now, presumably one aspect that concerns leaders who describe yourself describing different groups with different senses of morality is the effect of preference formation.
Yes.
Particularly on, let's say, the children.
Yes.
You see this very plainly in minority religious communities, Amish, Orthodox Jews, and so on. And now, is the segregation, what I'm getting at is what are the, I guess what I'm edging toward is the big question of the implication of liberal ideas for education, the formation of the preferences of the next generation.
Yes.
Do we authorize dozens of school systems, separate, self-perpetuating communities? This seems to offer some kind of a challenge to liberalism.
I want to, and whether it can be done or not, I mean, I don't have a theory of it. I just know, I think I'd recognize an attractive one if I saw it, but I have never seen one. What one wants is two things. First, no interference with a wide variety of people arguing, attempting to persuade, offering models. It's no part of my version of liberalism that novels shouldn't be written trying to counteract the parental influence, or that the parent shouldn't say that's a rotten novel, right? So one ingredient of a desirable theory of education is that it encourages attempts at persuasion. But another ingredient is that it leaves people free to judge on the merits, and that the theory should argue against interventions which are likely to alter convictions and preferences other than for good reasons. I mean, for what are perceived in the way of reasons for changing one's mind. So that is, you want to encourage argument and you want to discourage other kinds of influences. Now, that's utopian, but certainly utopian below a certain age. Because below a certain age, presumably, this distinction I keep emphasizing between getting someone to think something and persuading that person to think it, we lose our grip on that distinction below a certain age. But I don't know what that age is. And certainly by the time of junior high schools and high schools, I believe education should be like that. So that education, you might say, should provide the other side of the story to the parents' side of the story. But without, and this does come to, we are reminded of the Supreme Court's decisions in the Amish cases, without in any way interfering with the parents' right of access. So we want multiple access. We don't want anyone banned, but we don't want anyone to occupy all the argumentative space. I don't know. That's a utopian kind of description. It's not a theory of education, but that would be the ideal.